Sometimes a man reaches a point in life where the only friend he needs walks on four legs and never asks for anything more than a warm place by the fire. For Thach Morgan, that friend was Cole, a scarred black dog who'd wandered into his life during the loneliest winter he'd ever known, deep in the Colorado mountains. Thach had built himself a simple cabin where he could live quietly, far from the noise and heartache of the world below. For 15 years, it had been just him and Cole, sharing meals and watching the seasons change through their single window. On this October evening, storm clouds were rolling in fast, bringing lightning that would soon turn their peaceful world into a nightmare of smoke and flame. When that door jammed shut with fire closing in, Thach thought his story was over. What happens when your survival depends on the heart of a loyal dog? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the pines like liquid gold, casting long shadows across the meadow where Thach Morgan sat on his porch, whittling a piece of mountain oak. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision, each stroke of the knife deliberate and sure. The walking stick was nearly finished, his third this year, though he'd given the others away to hikers who'd stumbled upon his remote cabin with worn-out boots and blistered feet. Cole lay stretched out beside him, the dog's black coat gleaming in the dappled sunlight. The shepherd mix bore scars across his muzzle from some long-ago encounter with wild creatures, but his amber eyes held a depth of understanding that never ceased to amaze Thach. Those eyes had watched him through 15 winters, 15 summers, 15 cycles of hope and memory. The cabin behind them stood as solid as the day Thach had driven the last nail into its cedar walls. Every board, every joint, every stone in the chimney had been placed by his own hands during that first desperate autumn when he'd fled civilization like a wounded animal seeking shelter. The structure was simple but sturdy. One main room with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace that could heat the entire space, and windows positioned to catch both the morning sun and the evening alpenglow that painted the peaks crimson each night. "Been 22 years since I first set foot in these mountains," Thach murmured to Cole, who lifted his head at the sound of his master's voice. "Came up here to scout trails for a mining company. Fool job, really. They wanted to punch a road through virgin wilderness just to haul out a few tons of silver ore." The dog's tail thumped once against the porch boards, a gentle acknowledgement that seemed to say he was listening. Thach had long ago stopped feeling foolish for talking to Cole as if he were human. In many ways, the dog understood him better than most people ever had. Those early years as a wilderness scout had been good ones. Thach had possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the land, to find game trails invisible to other men, to predict where streams would run highest in spring, to sense the subtle signs that warned of avalanche danger or sudden weather changes. The mining companies and survey crews had paid him well for that knowledge, and he'd earned a reputation from Canada to New Mexico as a man who could find his way through country that would swallow other guides without a trace. But reputation, he'd learned, was a double-edged gift. The more sought after he became, the more demands were placed upon his time and conscience. Companies wanted him to mark routes through sacred burial grounds. Developers wanted him to find ways around environmental protections. Politicians wanted him to verify claims about wilderness areas that he knew were lies. The breaking point had come on a bitter February morning in Montana, when he'd been hired to guide a group of investors to a proposed ski resort site. The place they wanted to develop was a hidden valley he'd discovered years earlier, a pristine bowl surrounded by peaks, with a crystalline lake that mirrored the sky and meadows where elk came to calve each spring. It had been his secret sanctuary, a place he'd never marked on any map or mentioned in any report. Standing in that snow-covered meadow, watching the investors discuss lift towers and parking lots and luxury condominiums, something fundamental had broken inside him. That night, he'd returned to his hotel room, written a letter of resignation that he never sent, and simply disappeared. By morning, he was driving west with everything he owned, packed into the back of an old pickup truck. The Colorado mountains had called to him like a half-remembered song. He'd driven these winding forest roads until his truck could go no farther, then hiked into the wilderness with a backpack, full of tools and a heart full of determination to find a place where he could live. According to his own terms, the land he'd chosen was perfect in its isolation, a small valley tucked between ridges, accessible only by a deer trail that wound through dense forest for 3 miles before emerging into the clearing where he'd built his home. A spring-fed creek provided fresh water year-round, and the southern exposure ensured his garden would receive adequate sunlight during the short mountain growing season. Building the cabin had been an act of meditation as much as construction. Each log was selected with care, each joint fitted with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove to anyone. He'd worked through that first autumn, racing against the coming snows, sleeping under canvas when rain fell, and pushing himself until his hands bled and his back screamed in protest. But as the walls rose and the roof took shape, something else had been building inside him, a sense of rightness that he hadn't felt in years. This was where he belonged, in this remote valley where the only sounds were wind in the pines and the murmur of running water. This was where he could live as men were meant to live, by the sweat of his brow and the strength of his back, accountable to no one but himself and the land that sustained him. The first winter had nearly broken him. The snows came early and deep that year, sealing him into the valley for 4 months straight. His supplies ran lower than he'd anticipated, and there were days when he wondered if his grand gesture of independence would end with his bones scattered on the cabin floor. A cautionary tale for anyone foolish enough to think they could turn their back on civilization. It was during the deepest part of that winter, when the thermometer hadn't climbed above 0 in 3 weeks, and his firewood was running dangerously low. The coal had appeared. Thatch had been splitting kindling behind the cabin when he'd heard the sound, a low whimper that was barely audible over the wind. He'd followed the sound to a snowdrift near the creek, where he'd found the dog half buried and nearly dead from cold and starvation. The animal was young then, maybe 2 years old, but already bearing the scars that marked him as a survivor of hard times. "Somebody threw you away, didn't they?" Thatch had whispered as he'd carried the half-frozen dog into the cabin. "Figured you were used up, not worth the trouble of feeding." He'd spent that night nursing Cole back to health, sharing his meager rations and warming the dog's frozen paws with his own body heat. By morning, it was clear that neither of them would be alone anymore. Cole had earned his keep from that first day, proving to be not just a companion, but a partner in the business of mountain survival. The dog possessed an uncanny ability to sense approaching weather, often alerting Thatch to coming storms hours before any human eye could read the signs. He could track wounded game through terrain that would challenge an experienced hunter, and his presence alone was enough to deter the mountain lions and bears that occasionally wandered too close to the cabin. But more than his practical skills, Cole had provided something Thatch hadn't realized he needed: a reason to stay human. It was easy, living alone in the wilderness, to let civilization's veneer slip away entirely. Men who lived too long in isolation sometimes forgot how to speak, how to care, how to maintain the small courtesies and connections that made them more than just clever animals. Cole demanded none of that, but his presence somehow preserved it. In caring for the dog, Thatch had to remain caring. In talking to him, Thatch kept the habit of communication alive. In protecting him, Thatch remembered what it felt like to be responsible for something beyond his own survival. The years had passed peacefully after that, each season bringing its own rhythms and rewards. Spring meant planting his garden and watching the wildflowers return to the meadows. Summer brought long days of fishing and hiking, of gathering berries and cutting firewood for the coming winter. Autumn was a time of harvest and preparation, of watching the aspen leaves turn gold against the evergreen backdrop of the high country. And winter was a time of quiet contentment, of books read by firelight and long conversations with Cole while snow piled against the windows. Now, as Thatch put the finishing touches on his latest walking stick, he reflected on how complete his life had become in its simplicity. He grew most of his own food, hunted and fished for protein, and made or repaired everything he needed with his own hands. His contact with the outside world was limited to occasional supply trips to the small town of Cedar Ridge, 20 miles down the mountain, and even those were becoming less frequent as he learned to be more self-sufficient. The stick was nearly perfect now, its surface smooth as silk beneath his calloused fingers. He'd carved a simple spiral pattern into the handle, the kind of design that felt right in a man's grip and would serve well on rocky trails. It was good work, honest work, the kind that connected a man to the materials he worked with and the purpose they would serve. Cole stretched and yawned, then padded to the edge of the porch where he could survey their domain. The dog still moved with the fluid grace of a younger animal, though Thatch could see hints of grey in his muzzle and a slight stiffness in his gait on cold mornings. They were both growing older up here, but they were growing older together, and that made all the difference. The afternoon was growing late, and already Thatch could see clouds building over the western peaks. October storms in these mountains could be unpredictable. Sometimes they brought gentle rains that lasted for days, washing the world clean and filling the creek with the sound of rushing water. Other times they arrived with fury, bringing lightning and wind that could turn a peaceful evening into something wild and dangerous. "Looks like we might have weather coming," he said to Cole, who had turned his attention to the western sky as if he'd been thinking the same thing. "Better check the wood supply before dark," as the two of them made their way around to the back of the cabin, where split logs were stacked in neat rows under a wooden shelter. Thatch felt that familiar sense of satisfaction that came from being prepared, from knowing that whatever the mountain weather might bring, he and Cole would face it together from the shelter of the home they'd built, with their own determination and sweat. He couldn't know. As he checked his supplies and watched the clouds darken over the peaks, that this would be the last peaceful evening they'd share in their mountain sanctuary. He couldn't know that the storm approaching would bring more than wind and rain. It would bring fire and terror, and a test of loyalty that would push both man and dog beyond anything they'd ever imagined possible. But for now, in the golden light of a perfect October afternoon, all was well in their small corner of the world. The walking stick lay finished on the porch, a testament to patient craftsmanship. The firewood was stacked high and dry, and Cole sat at his master's side, amber eyes alert and faithful, ready for whatever challenges the mountains might bring. The first sign of trouble came just after sunset, when Cole began pacing the cabin floor with an agitation Thatch had rarely seen in all their years together. The dog's amber eyes were fixed on the western windows, and a low growl rumbled deep in his chest, not the warning sound he made when bears wandered too close, but something else entirely. Something that spoke of danger approaching from beyond the ridge. "What is it, boy?" Thatch asked, setting down the cup of pine needle tea he'd been sipping by the fire. He moved to the window and peered out into the gathering darkness, but saw nothing unusual. The storm clouds had thickened throughout the evening, blotting out the stars, but that was hardly cause for Cole's obvious distress. The dog whined and scratched at the door, then returned to his pacing. His behavior was so unlike his usual calm demeanor that Thatch felt the first stirrings of unease in his own chest. In 15 years of shared experience, Cole had never been wrong about danger. If something was coming, Thatch had learned to trust the dog's instincts over his own limited human senses. Thunder rumbled in the distance, still far off, but growing closer. The wind had picked up too, setting the pine boughs to swaying and creaking around the cabin. It was going to be a wild night, that much was certain, but mountain storms were nothing new to either of them. They'd weathered dozens of them in this same cabin, listening to the rain drum against the roof and watching lightning illuminate the peaks. Thatch was reaching for his jacket to step outside and take a better look around when the first flash lit up the sky. Not the diffuse glow of distant lightning, but a brilliant white-hot fork that seemed to strike the earth just beyond the western ridge. The thunder that followed was immediate and deafening, shaking the cabin windows in their frames. Cole barked once, sharp and urgent, then bolted for the door. This time, when he scratched at the wood, Thatch didn't hesitate. He grabbed his heavy coat from its peg and followed the dog outside, where the smell of ozone hung thick in the air and the wind carried an undertone that made his nostrils flare with instinctive, alarm smoke. He climbed onto the porch, railing for a better view, and felt his heart sink as he saw the orange glow beginning to build beyond the ridge. The lightning had found its mark in the dry timber, and somewhere in the forest that had been his sanctuary for 15 years. A fire was being born. October had been unusually dry, with barely a trace of rain in the past 6 weeks. The undergrowth was tinder dry, and the pine needles on the forest floor crackled underfoot like paper. It was exactly the kind of conditions that could turn a single lightning strike into a crown fire that would race through the canopy faster than a man could run. Another lightning bolt split the night, and another, as if the storm was deliberately feeding the flames it had started. With each flash, Thatch could see more clearly the growing wall of orange light beyond the ridge. The fire was moving, spreading through the dry timber with frightening speed. Cole stood beside him, no longer agitated but alert and waiting. The dog understood danger in ways that humans often couldn't, and his stillness now was not calm but readiness, the poised attention of a creature prepared to act the moment action was required. We might have to run for it. "Old friend," Thatch murmured, though even as he spoke the words, his heart rebelled against the idea. This cabin was more than just shelter. It was the physical manifestation of everything he'd built his life around. Every log, every stone, every carefully fitted joint represented not just labor but love, not just construction, but creation of the first real home he'd ever known. The wind shifted, and suddenly the smoke smell was stronger, carried on gusts that made the flames beyond the ridge flicker and dance higher into the night sky. Thatch tried to calculate the distance and the likely path of the fire. If it stayed on the far side of the creek, there was a chance it might burn itself out against the natural firebreak of the rocky ravine. But if the wind carried burning embers across the water, as if summoned by his fears, a shower of sparks suddenly appeared above the trees, glowing red against the black sky like malevolent stars. The wind caught them and scattered them across his clearing, and Thatch watched with growing dread as several landed on his roof. He grabbed the ladder from behind the cabin and scrambled up to check for spots of fire, Cole barking anxiously below. The cedar shingles were old and dry, perfect kindling for any spark that found a hold. He found 3 small glowing spots and quickly stamped them out with his boots. But even as he worked, more embers were falling like deadly snow. The fire had crested the ridge now, and Thatch could see its true scope for the first time. What had started as a single lightning strike had become a wall of flame nearly a quarter-mile wide, consuming everything in its path with an appetite that seemed almost alive. The sound it made was like a distant freight train, a low rumble punctuated by the crack and crash of falling trees. He climbed down from the roof and began throwing his most precious possessions into a canvas pack. His grandfather's compass, the few photographs he'd kept from his old life, the journal where he recorded weather patterns and wildlife observations. But with every item he grabbed, 2 more seemed to demand attention. How do you choose what to save from a life's worth of careful accumulation? Cole appeared at his elbow with something in his mouth, the leather collar he'd worn when he first arrived at the cabin, the one Thatch had replaced years ago but kept hanging on a peg by the door. The brass nameplate was tarnished now, but the leather was still supple, still bearing the scent of those first desperate days when 2 lonely creatures had found salvation in each other's company. Good thinking. "Boy," Thatch said, his voice rough with emotion as he stuffed the collar into his pack. At least, if everything else burned, they'd still have that tangible reminder of how their partnership began. The wind was getting stronger now, driving the fire toward them with increasing speed. Thatch could hear individual trees igniting with sounds like enormous torches being lit, and the smoke was thick enough to make his eyes water. They had minutes, not hours, before the flames would reach the clearing. He shouldered his pack and headed for the door, intending to make one last sweep of the cabin for anything else he couldn't bear to lose. But as he reached for the handle, something stopped him cold. The old wooden door, which had opened and closed smoothly for 15 years, wouldn't budge. He put his shoulder against it and pushed, but the door held fast. The frame had warped in the heat, or debris had fallen against it from outside. Either way, he was trapped in his own home, while wildfire raced toward them through the forest. Cole sensed the problem immediately and began clawing at the base of the door, his powerful legs driving against the wood with desperate strength. But the door was solid oak, built to keep out mountain weather and wild animals, and no amount of scratching would break it down. Thatch tried the windows, but they were too small for a man of his size to climb through. And besides, the glass was already starting to crack from the heat. The smoke was seeping through every gap in the cabin's construction now, making it hard to breathe and harder to think clearly. The sound of the approaching fire was like standing next to a waterfall, a constant roar that drowned out everything else. Through the windows, he could see individual flames beginning to lick at the edge of his clearing, testing the air for the next fuel to consume. This was how it would end then. After 15 years of self-sufficient mountain living, after surviving winters that had broken lesser men, after building a life based on preparation and careful planning, he would die trapped in his own home by a door that had worked perfectly until the moment he needed it most. Cole continued his assault on the door, throwing his full weight against it now in powerful charges that shook the entire frame. The dog's determination was heartbreaking to watch, but Thatch knew it was hopeless. The door was simply too strong, and they were running out of time. The heat was building inside the cabin now, and outside the windows, Thatch could see the first flames beginning to climb the trees at the edge of his clearing. Soon the fire would reach the cabin itself, and then Cole's barking had changed, becoming more urgent and commanding. The dog was no longer just attacking the door. He was calling to his master, demanding attention, demanding action. In his amber eyes, Thatch could see something he'd never seen before. Not just loyalty, but a fierce determination that seemed to burn as bright as the approaching flames. The smoke was getting thicker inside the cabin, and Thatch could feel panic starting to claw at the edges of his mind like a living thing. He'd faced dangerous situations before, avalanches that could bury a man in seconds, blizzards that turned familiar terrain into a white maze of death, encounters with grizzly bears that had tested every survival instinct he possessed. But this was different. This was being trapped like a rat, while everything he'd built burned around him. Cole had stopped his frantic assault on the door and was now standing perfectly still, his scarred head tilted, as if listening to something Thatch couldn't hear. The dog's amber eyes reflected the growing orange glow from outside, but there was no fear in them, only that intense focus that Thatch had learned to recognize over 15 years of shared dangers. "What is it, boy?" Thatch gasped through the smoke. His throat was raw now, and each breath was becoming harder to draw. The heat inside the cabin was rising steadily, and he could hear the fire beginning to consume the trees closest to his clearing. Soon the cabin itself would be surrounded by flames, and even if they could get the door open, there might be nowhere to run. Cole moved to the fireplace and began pawing at the loose stones near the hearth, not the careful scratching he'd done at the door, but deliberate, purposeful digging. At first, Thatch thought the dog had simply lost his mind from fear, but then he remembered something from those early days of cabin construction, the root cellar. When he'd built the cabin, Thatch had excavated a small storage space beneath the floor near the fireplace, a cool, dry place to keep preserved foods and emergency supplies. The entrance was hidden beneath a section of removable floorboards, covered over with loose stones from the hearth for camouflage. In all the years since, he'd rarely used it, preferring to keep his stores in the more convenient pantry off the main room. But Cole remembered. Somehow, the dog had retained the knowledge of that hidden space from watching Thatch work on it during their first year together. And now, with flames closing in and the door refusing to budge, Cole was trying to show him the way out. Thatch dropped to his knees beside the fireplace and began pulling away the loose stones Cole had been digging at. His fingers found the edge of the concealed floorboards, and he pried them up to reveal the dark opening below. The space was smaller than he remembered, barely large enough for a man to crawl through, but it connected to a tunnel he'd dug that led outside. Emerging behind the cabin near the woodshed, he'd almost forgotten about that tunnel. It had seemed like a good idea at the time, a bolt hole in case he ever needed to escape quickly, but the entrance outside had become overgrown with brush over the years. Still, if the opening was still clear, it might be their only chance. Cole was already squeezing through the narrow opening, his black form disappearing into the darkness below. Thatch grabbed his pack and the water bucket from beside the hearth, then followed, dropping down into the cramped space that smelled of earth and old wood. The tunnel was even smaller than he remembered, forcing him to crawl on his hands and knees while dragging his supplies behind him. The air down here was cleaner, though, filtered through soil and stone, and for the first time since the door had jammed, Thatch felt like he could breathe properly. Cole was ahead of him somewhere in the darkness, and Thatch could hear the dog's claws scrabbling against dirt and rocks as he worked his way toward the outside entrance. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, though Thatch knew it couldn't be more than 20 feet long. His shoulders scraped against the earthen walls, and roots hung down to catch at his hair and clothing. Behind them, the sound of the fire was muffled but still audible, a constant roar punctuated by crashes as burning trees fell across his clearing. The heat was following them down into the tunnel too, and Thatch realized with growing dread that even if they reached the outside entrance, they might emerge into a world that was already consumed by flames. Cole's barking echoed back to him through the tunnel, urgent and demanding. The dog had reached the entrance and was trying to force his way through what sounded like a significant obstruction. Years of neglect had allowed brush and debris to accumulate over the opening, and now their escape route was blocked by nature's own barricade. Thatch crawled faster, ignoring the pain in his knees and the burning in his lungs. When he reached Cole's position, he found the dog frantically digging at a tangle of root and branch that had grown across the tunnel mouth. Through the gaps, Thatch could see orange light dancing. The fire had reached this side of the cabin too, but it hadn't yet consumed everything. Working together, man and dog clawed at the obstruction. Thatch's knife proved useful for cutting through some of the smaller roots, while Cole's powerful jaws made quick work of branches that had been deadened by years of burial. Slowly, agonizingly, they carved an opening large enough for them to squeeze through. The outside world that greeted them was like a vision of hell. The fire had indeed reached the area behind the cabin, and flames were dancing through the treetops above their heads. But miracle of miracles, a narrow corridor of unburned ground stretched away from the cabin toward the creek, a path of salvation bordered on both sides by walls of flame. Cole emerged from the tunnel first, his black coat now grey with dirt and ash. Thatch followed, dragging his pack and the water bucket, his eyes streaming from the smoke and heat. The temperature outside was brutal, like standing in front of an open furnace, and the air shimmered with waves of heat that distorted everything beyond a few yards. They had to move immediately. The fire was closing in from both sides, and the narrow corridor of escape was shrinking by the minute. But as they prepared to run for their lives, Thatch made a devastating discovery. His cabin was fully engulfed now, flames shooting through the roof and windows like angry tongues. But it wasn't just the building burning, it was everything. His workshop with 15 years' worth of carefully crafted tools. His garden, where he'd grown the vegetables that sustained them through countless winters. The woodshed where he'd stored enough fuel to last through the coldest months. Most heartbreaking of all was the sight of his handmade furniture burning inside the cabin. the table where he and Cole had shared. Thousands of meals, the chair where he'd sat to read by firelight, the bed where he'd slept peacefully while mountain winds howled outside. All of it was being consumed by flames that showed no mercy for the love and labor that had gone into every piece. Cole pressed against his leg, a warm reminder that not everything precious could be destroyed by fire. The dog's presence steadied him, reminded him that they were alive, they were together, and they still had a chance to stay that way if they moved quickly. The path to the creek was their only hope now, but it wouldn't remain open much longer. On both sides, the fire was spreading through the canopy above, raining down sparks and burning debris that could block their escape route at any moment. They would have to run faster and farther than either of them had ever run before, through heat that could kill and smoke that could blind, with nothing but their determination and their bond to see them through. Thatch shouldered his pack, gripped the water bucket, and looked down at Cole. The dog was waiting for his signal, ember eyes bright with trust and readiness. Whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced everything else. Together, the run to the creek was like racing through the mouth of a dragon. Heat pressed against them from all sides, so intense that Thatch could feel his eyebrows singeing and his lungs burning with each breath. The narrow corridor between the walls of flame was closing fast, branches overhead beginning to catch and spread the fire across their only escape route. Cole ran beside him with the fluid grace of a wolf, his powerful legs eating up the ground, while his amber eyes stayed fixed on the path ahead. The dog seemed to navigate by instinct through the choking smoke, leading them around fallen logs and burning debris that Thatch could barely see until they were almost upon it. 20 yards from the cabin, Thatch stumbled over a root hidden in the ash and smoke, going down hard on his knees. The water bucket flew from his grip, spilling its precious contents across the superheated ground, where it hissed and vanished in an instant. Pain shot up his leg, and for a terrifying moment he thought he might not be able to get back up. Cole was beside him immediately, pressing his solid body against Thatch's shoulder, offering himself as a brace while the older man struggled to his feet. The dog's fur was hot to the touch, heated by the ambient temperature of their hellish surroundings. But his presence was steadier than any walking stick. They pressed on, lungs searing with each breath of superheated air. The fire was making its own weather now, creating wind currents that sent sparks swirling around them like malevolent snow. Several times, Thatch had to beat out small fires that caught on his jacket, while Cole's thick coat protected him from all but the largest embers. The sound was overwhelming, not just the roar of flames consuming everything in their path, but the explosive crack of trees splitting from the heat, the crash of falling timber, and underneath it all, a sound like a freight train that seemed to come from the fire itself. It was as if the mountain was screaming in pain. 50 yards, 75. The creek had to be close now, but the smoke was so thick that Thatch couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. His eyes streamed constantly, tears evaporating almost as quickly as they formed. The heat was beginning to affect his thinking too, making everything seem dreamlike and unreal. It was Cole who found the creek bank, suddenly veering left toward what looked like solid wall of smoke. But as they pushed through the grey curtain, Thatch heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the gentle murmur of running water. They tumbled down the creek bank together, landing in the shallow water with splashes that sent up clouds of steam. The creek was only a few feet deep here, but it was moving fast, fed by the mountain springs that never ran dry. For the first time since their escape began, Thatch allowed himself to hope that they might actually survive. The water was shockingly cold against their overheated bodies. Cole immediately began lapping at it, trying to cool his parched throat, while Thatch cupped handfuls to his face and let the blessed coolness soak into his burned skin. They were both covered in ash and soot, their appearances transformed into something that belonged more in a coal mine than a mountain forest. But even here, beside the life-giving water, they weren't safe. The fire was still spreading, still consuming everything in its path. Burning branches fell into the creek around them, hissing and steaming as the water fought against the flames. And the wind was shifting again, threatening to drive the fire directly toward their position. Thatch knew they couldn't stay here. The creek would provide temporary protection, but if the fire jumped to the far bank, and with embers flying everywhere, that was almost inevitable. They would be trapped again. This time with nowhere to run. "We have to keep moving," he told Cole, who seemed to understand the urgency in his voice. The dog had stopped drinking and was already looking downstream, as if calculating their next move. They began wading through the water, staying low to avoid the worst of the smoke. The creek bed was rocky and uneven, making for treacherous footing, but it was the only clear path available to them. On both banks, the fire was advancing like an army, consuming everything in its path with methodical efficiency. As they moved downstream, Thatch began to recognize landmarks despite the apocalyptic transformation of his familiar landscape. That blackened snag had been a majestic pine where he'd often seen eagles perching. The smoldering heap of logs had been a beaver dam that had created a small pond where he'd sometimes fished in the early morning hours. Everything was being erased. 15 years of careful observation and intimate knowledge reduced to ash and memory. The trails he'd walked thousands of times were gone. The camping spots where he'd spent nights under the stars were burning. Even the rocks seemed changed, blackened and cracked by the intense heat. But gradually, as they put distance between themselves and the worst of the fire, the devastation began to show gaps. Here and there, patches of green survived where the creek's moisture had created natural fire breaks. A cluster of aspen trees still stood untouched, their golden autumn leaves bright against the blackened landscape like flags of hope. Cole was limping slightly now, favoring his left front paw. When they reached a shallow pool where the creek widened, Thatch called a halt to examine the injury. The dog's paw pad was burned, probably from running across superheated ground. But it wasn't severe enough to prevent travel. "You're tougher than old leather," Thatch murmured, gently cleaning the wound with cool creek water. Cole bore the ministration patiently, though his eyes never stopped scanning their surroundings for signs of danger. The immediate crisis was past. They were alive. They were together, and they were moving away from the worst of the fire. But as Thatch looked back at the orange glow that marked the location of his destroyed home, the full weight of their situation began to settle on his shoulders. They had escaped with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the few items in his hastily packed bag. No food, no shelter, no tools beyond his pocket knife. Winter was coming to the mountains, and they were now homeless refugees in a landscape that had been transformed into something alien and hostile. The nearest town was 20 miles away over difficult terrain, much of which might now be impassable due to the fire. He had no way to call for help, no way to signal their location to potential rescuers. For all practical purposes, they were as isolated as castaways on a desert island. But as he looked down at Cole, who was waiting patiently for the next stage of their journey, Thatch felt a flicker of the same determination that had carried him through that first brutal winter 15 years ago. They had survived the immediate danger through courage and loyalty. Whatever came next, they would face it the same way. The creek continued to flow toward the valley, toward civilization and safety. All they had to do was follow it, one step at a time, and trust that their bond was strong enough to carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. By dawn, they had covered nearly 3 miles downstream, following the creek's winding path through a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien planet. The fire had moved on, leaving behind a world of ash and blackened stumps. But the air still carried the acrid smell of destruction, and wisps of smoke rose from hidden embers that continued to smolder in the ruins of what had once been pristine wilderness. Thatch's body ached in ways he hadn't felt since his younger days as a scout, when he'd sometimes pushed himself beyond reasonable limits to meet impossible deadlines. His knees protested every step on the rocky creek bed, his shoulders burned from carrying the pack, and his throat felt raw from breathing smoke and superheated air. But Cole was struggling more visibly. his injured paw forcing him to favor his other 3 legs with each careful step. They needed rest, shelter, and most critically, they needed to find some source of food and clean water. The creek provided the latter, but Thatch's emergency supplies consisted of little more than a handful of jerky, some hardtack, and his grandfather's compass, enough to sustain them for perhaps a day, certainly no longer. As the morning light grew stronger, illuminating the extent of the devastation around them, Thatch began to recognize their approximate location. If his memory served, they were somewhere near the old logging camp that had been abandoned decades ago when the timber company moved their operations farther north. There might still be structures standing there, maybe even supplies left behind by hunters or hikers who had used the site as a way station over the years. Cole seemed to sense the change in their direction when Thatch turned away from the creek toward a ridge that showed fewer signs of fire damage. The dog's tail, which had drooped with exhaustion, lifted slightly, and his amber eyes regained some of their alert intelligence. The climb up from the creek was brutal for both of them. The ground was still hot in places, and ash clouds rose with every step, coating them in a fine grey dust that turned to mud when mixed with their sweat. Several times Thatch had to stop and rest, not just for his own sake, but to give Cole's injured paw a break from the rough terrain. But as they crested the ridge, Thatch's memory proved accurate. Below them, in a small valley that had been largely spared by the fire, sat the remains of the old logging camp. Most of the structures were long gone, claimed by weather and time. But one building still stood, a small cabin that had probably housed the camp foreman, built more solidly than the temporary shelters that had once surrounded it. "Look at that, Cole," Thatch whispered, his voice hoarse but carrying a note of hope for the first time since their ordeal began. "Maybe our luck is starting to turn." The cabin was in rough condition, with a partially collapsed roof and walls that showed the effects of years of neglect. But it had 4 walls and enough ceiling to provide basic shelter. More importantly, as they approached, Thatch could see that someone had used it relatively recently. There were signs of a fire ring outside, and the door, though weathered, looked like it had been repaired within the past few years. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A rough wooden table sat against one wall, and shelves lined another. Most promising of all was a cache of supplies that some thoughtful soul had left for emergencies exactly like this one. Canned goods, a sleeping bag, waterproof matches, and even a first aid kit. Cole collapsed gratefully onto the cabin's plank floor, finally allowing himself to rest properly for the first time since their escape began. Thatch knelt beside him and carefully examined the injured paw, cleaning it more thoroughly with water from his canteen and applying antiseptic from the first aid kit. The burn wasn't as bad as he'd feared, but it would need care to prevent infection. As he worked, Thatch found himself talking to Cole about their situation, partly to comfort the dog, but mostly to help organize his own thoughts. "We've got shelter for now, and enough food for maybe a week if we're careful. But we can't stay here forever. The fire's still spreading, and even if it doesn't reach this valley, we're going to need real medical attention for both of us." Cole's response was to rest his scarred muzzle on Thatch's knee, a gesture of trust that never failed to move the old man. Despite everything they'd been through, the terror of being trapped, the hellish run through the flames, the grueling night-long march through devastated wilderness, the dog's faith in him remained absolute. But Thatch felt the weight of that trust heavily. Cole was depending on him to get them both to safety, and the responsibility was daunting. At 68 years old, Thatch was no longer the young man who had first ventured into these mountains with nothing but determination and a backpack. His reflexes were slower, his endurance limited, and the margin for error in their current situation was razor-thin. The sound of aircraft passing overhead interrupted his brooding. Looking up through the gaps in the cabin's damaged roof, he could see helicopters and planes, the aerial firefighting force that was undoubtedly working to contain the blaze they'd barely escaped. For a moment, he considered trying to signal them, But they were flying high and fast, focused on the active fire zones, not searching for survivors in areas the fire had already passed through. Besides, he realized with growing concern, officially, he didn't exist. His cabin had never been registered with any government agency. He paid no property taxes, received no mail delivery. He'd lived off the grid so completely that there would be no records of his presence in the fire zone. No one would be looking for Thach Morgan because no one knew he had been there to begin with. The implications of this realization were sobering. They couldn't count on rescue. They would have to save themselves. And with Cole injured and both of them exhausted, that was going to require careful planning and no small amount of luck. As if sensing his master's dark thoughts, Cole lifted his head and looked directly into Thach's eyes. In that amber gaze, Thach saw not just trust, but determination. The same fierce will to survive that had brought the dog to his door during that terrible first winter. The same stubborn refusal to give up that had driven him to attack an oak door with nothing but determination and loyalty. "You're right, boy," Thach said softly, scratching behind the dog's scarred ears. "We didn't come this far just to quit now. We'll rest here today, get our strength back, and then we'll figure out how to get ourselves home." Home. The word had a different meaning now than it had 12 hours ago. Home was no longer a hand-built cabin in a hidden valley that was gone forever, reduced to ash and memory. Now home meant simply wherever they could be together, safe and free to continue the partnership that had sustained them both through 15 years of mountain living. As the day wore on, and the distant sound of firefighting aircraft continued overhead, Thach began to formulate a plan for their survival. 3 days passed in the abandoned logging cabin, and with each sunrise, Thach felt the weight of their situation pressing down on him like the mountain itself. Cole's paw was healing well, but the dog remained subdued, spending long hours lying by the single window, watching the ash-laden landscape with eyes that seemed to reflect his master's growing concerns. The emergency supplies were holding out, but barely. Thach had rationed their food carefully, a can of beans shared between them for breakfast, a handful of crackers at midday, and whatever small game he could catch for their evening meal. His old trapping skills had served them well, providing 2 rabbits and a grouse. But the pickings were slim in this fire-scarred wasteland where most wildlife had either fled or perished. More troubling than their dwindling supplies was the growing realization that the outside world had moved on from their crisis. The aerial firefighting operations had ceased 2 days ago, suggesting the blaze was either contained or had burned itself out against natural barriers. But no ground crews had appeared in their valley. No search and rescue teams had come looking for survivors. As far as the authorities were concerned, this area had been evacuated or was simply uninhabited. On the 4th morning, Thach made a decision that felt like surrendering a piece of his soul. He took out his grandfather's compass, the one artifact from his old life that had guided him through countless wilderness journeys, and began planning their route to Cedar Ridge, the small mountain town that represented their only realistic hope of reaching civilization. The compass was a thing of beauty, its brass case worn smooth by decades of handling, its needle steady and true, despite everything it had endured. Thach's grandfather had carried it through the trenches of France during the Great War, and later through the Depression-era forests where he'd worked as a timber cruiser. It had passed to Thach's father, who'd used it during his own brief career as a surveyor, and finally to Thach himself when the old man died. 20 miles as the crow flies, Thach murmured to Cole, who had positioned himself beside the makeshift map Thach was drawing in the dirt floor. "But we're not crows, are we, boy? We'll have to go around the worst of the burn zones. Follow the valleys where we can find water and maybe some shelter." Cole's tail thumped once against the floor, a gesture of agreement or encouragement that had become one of their most important forms of communication during these dark days. The dog's resilience continued to amaze Thach, despite his injury, despite the trauma of their escape. Despite the uncertainty of their situation, Cole remained steady and faithful. ready to follow wherever his master led, but Thatch wasn't sure he deserved that faith anymore. At 68, he felt every one of his years in ways he never had before. The fire had stripped away more than just his cabin and possessions. It had revealed the fragility of the life he'd built, the precarious nature of his independence. For the first time since he'd fled to these mountains, he found himself questioning whether his self-imposed exile had been wisdom or simply elaborate cowardice. The doubts had been building since their first night in the cabin, crystallizing into a painful self-examination that he couldn't shake. Had he spent 15 years hiding from life rather than living it? Had his retreat into the wilderness been noble independence, or just an old man's fear of facing a world that no longer seemed to need him? These questions tormented him as he prepared for the journey ahead, packing their meager supplies and checking his grandfather's compass one final time. Cole seemed to sense his master's internal struggle, pressing closer than usual and offering the wordless comfort that had sustained them both through countless challenges. "You know what the hardest part is, old friend?" Thatch said as he shouldered his pack and prepared to leave their temporary shelter. "It's not knowing if I've got enough left in me to get us both home safe. I used to be certain about things, about my abilities, about my place in the world. But this fire, it's burned away more than just trees and buildings. It's shown me how small and vulnerable I really am." The admission felt like a physical weight lifting from his chest. For 15 years, he'd cultivated an image of himself as completely self-sufficient, a man who needed nothing from the world beyond what he could provide with his own hands and knowledge. But here he was, dependent on the kindness of strangers who'd left emergency supplies, relying on rescue by people who might not even know he existed, sustained by the loyalty of a dog who deserved better than an old man's failing courage. They stepped outside into a morning that looked like the aftermath of war. The air still carried the smell of smoke, and everything, trees, rocks, the very ground they walked on, was coated with a fine layer of ash that stirred with every breath of wind. In the distance, skeletal remains of burned forests stretched across the ridges like the ribs of some enormous dead creature. But as they began walking, something remarkable happened. Cole, who had been moving gingerly on his injured paw for days, suddenly seemed to find new strength. His stride became more confident, his head lifted higher, and when he looked back at Thatch, his amber eyes carried a spark of something that looked remarkably like hope. The dog's resilience triggered something in Thatch as well, a memory of why he'd survived that first brutal winter, why he'd been successful as a wilderness scout, why he'd been drawn to these mountains in the first place. It wasn't just about self-sufficiency or independence. It was about the quiet strength that came from facing challenges honestly, from accepting help when it was offered, from recognizing that survival was often a cooperative venture between species, between individuals who chose to care for each other. As they walked through the devastated landscape, following game trails that were slowly recovering from the fire's passage, Thatch began to see signs of renewal alongside the destruction. Green shoots were already pushing up through the ash in places where the fire had burned less intensely. Birds were beginning to return, attracted by the insects and small creatures that were emerging from their hiding places. Life, it seemed, was remarkably persistent in its determination to continue. Maybe that's the lesson here. "Cole," Thatch said as they paused to rest beside a small spring that had somehow survived the conflagration. "Maybe it's not about being strong enough to face everything alone. Maybe it's about being smart enough to accept that we need each other, all of us, whether we walk on 2 legs or 4. Cole's response was to drink deeply from the spring, then settle beside his master with the patient contentment of a creature who had never doubted the wisdom of loyalty and partnership. In that simple gesture, Thatch found a peace he hadn't felt since. The night the lightning first split the sky, above their mountain home, they had been walking for 2 days, through the burned wilderness when Cole suddenly stopped dead in his tracks, his ears pricked forward and his whole body rigid with attention. Thatch followed the dog's gaze across a small clearing and felt his heart skip a beat at what he saw. Smoke was rising from a stand of trees that had somehow escaped the fire's fury. But this wasn't the wild, chaotic smoke of burning forest. This was the controlled, purposeful smoke of a campfire, rising straight and steady into the still morning air. Other people. After 15 years of self-imposed isolation, after days of believing they were completely alone in a devastated wilderness, they had found, or been found by, other human beings. Thatcher's first instinct was to retreat, to circle wide around the camp and continue towards Cedar Ridge without making contact. Old habits died hard, and his hermit's wariness of strangers ran deep. But Cole was already moving toward the smoke, his tail held high with excitement, and Thatch realized that his own fears might be endangering them both. They needed help, whether his pride wanted to admit it or not. As they approached the camp, Thatch could make out voices, at least 3 people, maybe more. The tone was casual, relaxed, not the urgent communication of people in distress. These weren't fellow fire refugees. They were something else entirely. Cole trotted ahead with growing confidence, and Thatch had to quicken his pace to keep up. The dog seemed to sense something about these strangers that reassured him, though Thatch couldn't imagine what that might be. They emerged into a well-organized campsite that made Thatch stop in his tracks with amazement. 3 large tents were arranged in a rough triangle around a central fire pit, with equipment and supplies laid out with military precision. Solar panels charged electronic devices, sophisticated communication equipment crackled with radio chatter, and maps covered a folding table under a canvas awning. But it was the people themselves who made Thatcher's breath catch in his throat. 2 young men and a woman, all wearing the distinctive green uniforms of the Forest Service, but with patches and gear he didn't recognize. They looked up as Cole bounded into their camp, and instead of alarm or surprise, their faces showed welcome, and something that looked remarkably like relief. "Well, I'll be damned," said the older of the 2 men, a weathered fellow with grey in his beard, who might have been Thatch's age. "You must be Thatch Morgan!" The words hit Thatch like a physical blow. These strangers knew his name. After 15 years of complete anonymity, of living so far off the grid that he'd assumed no one even knew he existed, these people had somehow identified him on sight. How? Thatch began. But the woman was already moving toward them, with a medical kit in her hands. Sarah Chen. "Search and rescue coordinator," she said briskly, kneeling to examine Cole's injured paw with practiced efficiency. "We've been looking for you for 3 days. Your dog here is going to be just fine, but we need to get both of you to a medical facility for proper evaluation." "Looking for me," Thatch repeated, his mind reeling. "But nobody knows I'm here. I don't have any record, any registration." "Actually, you do," said the bearded man, extending a calloused hand. "Tom Bradley, Forest Service Emergency Response, and you've got more of a record than you might think." The younger man, who couldn't have been more than 30, was setting up what looked like a satellite communication system. "We've been monitoring your weather reports for 8 years, he said, without looking up from his equipment. "The National Weather Service has been using your observations for their mountain forecasts. They list you as Remote Station 7 in their database." Thatch stared at them in bewilderment. "Weather reports? I don't send any weather reports." Sarah looked up from her examination of Cole's paw. "Every time you went to town for supplies, you stopped at the post office. Mrs. Henderson has been copying your journal entries and forwarding them to the Weather Service. Apparently, you keep more detailed and accurate records than most of their official stations." The revelation staggered Thatch. Mrs. Henderson at the Cedar Ridge post office. He'd barely spoken a dozen words to her in all his years of supply runs. He'd never imagined she was even paying attention to him, let alone reading his private journals and sharing them with government agencies. "She was worried about you," Tom continued. "When the fire started, she called the Forest Service and told them there was a man living alone up in the burn zone. Took us a while to figure out where, but your weather observations gave us enough clues to narrow down the search area." Cole was enjoying Sarah's attention. his tail wagging as she cleaned and bandaged his paw with supplies that were clearly far superior to anything Thatch could have provided. The dog seemed completely at ease with these strangers, as if he'd been waiting for them to arrive. "The thing is," the young technician said, finally looking up from his communication array, "you're something of a local legend. People in town call you the ghost of the mountains. This mysterious figure who shows up every few months, buys supplies, and disappears back into the wilderness. Mrs. Henderson says you've helped dozens of lost hikers over the years, always quietly, always without taking credit." Thatch shook his head slowly. "I just gave them directions, maybe some food if they needed it. It wasn't anything special. Special enough that 3 different families sent letters to the Forest Service asking us to find you and make sure you were safe," Tom said. "Seems like you made quite an impression on their kids." The memories came flooding back. A family with young children who'd gotten lost on the old mining trail. A teenage girl who'd twisted her ankle on a solo hike. A young couple whose car had broken down near the creek crossing. In each case, he'd simply done what any decent person would do, offered help to people who needed it. He'd never thought of those brief encounters as significant. Certainly never imagined they would lead to organized search and rescue efforts. Sarah finished her work on Cole's paw and turned her attention to Thatch himself, checking his pulse and examining his hands and face for injuries. "You're dehydrated and you've got some minor burns, but nothing that won't heal," she pronounced. "The question now is what you want to do next." "I don't understand," Thatch said. Tom spread a map out on the table, pointing to an area marked with red crosses. "Your entire valley is gone, burned down to bedrock. But the Forest Service has been talking about establishing a permanent weather monitoring station in this region, and frankly, you're the best candidate we've ever seen for the job." "A job?" The concept seemed alien after so many years of complete self-sufficiency. "Official position, government salary, full benefits," Sarah said. "You'd be stationed at the new ranger cabin we're building about 5 miles from where your old place was. Close enough to familiar territory, far enough from the burn zone to be safe." The young technician, his name tag read Martinez, grinned at Thatch's expression. "Plus, you'd get an official weather monitoring station with satellite uplink and everything. Think of it as an upgrade from your handwritten journals." Cole padded over to Thatch and sat beside him, pressing his warm body against his master's leg. The dog looked up with those amber eyes that held so much wisdom and trust, and in that moment, Thatch realized that his old life hadn't just been destroyed by fire. It had been transformed by the connections he'd never known he was making. By the community he'd served without realizing it. By the simple truth that no man is truly an island, no matter how hard he tries to be one. The offer hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful and tempting, but somehow insubstantial. After 15 years of complete independence, the idea of taking a government job, of having a boss and a schedule and official responsibilities, felt as foreign to Thatch as learning to breathe underwater. But as he looked around at the professional efficiency of the search and rescue camp, at the genuine concern in these strangers' faces, at Cole, who was already making friends with Sarah as she finished treating his paw, Thatch felt something shifting inside him. The rigid walls he'd built around his solitary life were developing cracks, and through those cracks, unexpected light was beginning to seep in. "I need time to think," he said finally. And Tom Bradley nodded with understanding. "Of course you do. This isn't the kind of decision a man makes in 5 minutes. The Forest Service coordinator rolled up his maps and secured them in a waterproof case. "Tell you what, we've got a helicopter coming in this afternoon to extract our team. You and Cole are welcome to ride with us to Cedar Ridge, get checked out at the medical clinic. Maybe spend a few days in town while you consider your options." The thought of helicopter rescue, of being lifted out of the wilderness he'd walked into on his own power, rankled against Thatch's sense of self-reliance. But one look at Cole, who was clearly exhausted despite his brave front, reminded him that this wasn't just about his own stubborn pride anymore. "The dog needs proper medical attention," Sarah added, as if reading his thoughts. That paw is healing well, but we should have a veterinarian take a look, make sure there's no infection starting. Cole's welfare settled the matter. All right, Thatch said. We'll accept the ride. But even as he spoke the words, he felt a profound sense of unease. Not fear, exactly, but something deeper, a recognition that accepting this help meant acknowledging that his old life was truly over. The mountain hermit, who had lived entirely by his own rules, was about to become just another person, dependent on the systems and services of civilization. As if sensing his master's internal struggle, Cole padded over and dropped something at Thatch's feet. It was a charred piece of wood, burned black, but still recognizable as part of the walking stick he'd been carving on that last peaceful afternoon before the fire changed everything. The dog must have picked it up during their escape from the cabin. Carrying it all this way without Thatch even noticing, the sight of that damaged wood hit Thatch harder than all the devastation they'd walked through. This stick represented his craftsmanship, his connection to the materials and tools of mountain living, his ability to create something beautiful and functional with nothing but his hands and patience. Now it was just a piece of charcoal, its careful carving obliterated by flames. But as he picked up the ruined stick, Thatch realized something important. The fire had destroyed the physical object, but it couldn't touch the knowledge that had created it. His hands still remembered how to shape wood. His eyes still knew how to read the grain. His mind still held decades of accumulated wisdom about living in harmony with the natural world. Martinez, the young technician, noticed his fascination with the charred wood. "You're thinking about what you've lost," he said quietly. "But maybe you should think about what you could build instead." "What do you mean?" "The new ranger station. It's not going to be some prefab government building. The Forest Service wants it to blend with the environment, to be a model of sustainable mountain architecture. They're going to need someone who understands how to build in this climate, how to work with local materials, how to create something that will last." Sarah looked up from packing her medical supplies. "The truth is, Mr. Morgan, we need you more than you might need us. Climate change is making weather patterns more unpredictable, and we're losing experienced observers faster than we can train new ones. Your knowledge of these mountains, your ability to read natural signs, that's irreplaceable." Tom Bradley joined the conversation, his weathered face serious. "There's something else you should know. The fire that burned your valley, it's part of a larger pattern we're seeing across the West. Hotter, drier conditions, more severe wildfire seasons. The old ways of forest management aren't working anymore. We need people who understand the land intimately, who can help us figure out how to adapt." The implications of his words were sobering. Thatch had assumed that his knowledge was becoming obsolete in an increasingly technological world. But these people were suggesting the opposite, that his skills were more valuable than ever, precisely because they represented a deeper, older way of understanding the natural world. Cole settled down beside the charred walking stick, his chin resting on the ruined wood as if he too understood its significance. The dog's amber eyes met Thatch's with that steady gaze that had sustained them both through 15 years of partnership. And in that look, Thatch saw something that surprised him. Cole wasn't just waiting for his master's decision, he was trusting him to make the right choice, whatever that might be. The dog's loyalty wasn't conditional on them returning to their old life in the mountains. It was absolute, unshakable, ready to follow whatever path Thatch chose to take. That realization brought with it another flash of understanding. Thatch's identity wasn't tied to a specific place or way of living. It was tied to his relationship with Cole, to his knowledge and skills, to his fundamental character as someone who helped others when help was needed. The fire had destroyed his cabin, but it hadn't destroyed who he was. As the afternoon wore on and the sound of approaching helicopter blades grew audible in the distance, Thatch found himself thinking about the families who had written letters asking the Forest Service to find him. He thought about Mrs. Henderson at the post office, quietly copying his weather observations because she understood their value even when he didn't. He thought about all the lost hikers he'd helped over the years, and how those brief encounters had apparently meant more to them than he'd ever realized. The helicopter appeared over the ridge like a mechanical dragonfly, its rotor wash stirring up clouds of ash as it settled into the clearing. The pilot, a woman with graying hair and confident hands, shut down the engine and climbed out to greet the search team. "Found your missing hermit. I see," she said with a grin, extending her hand to Thatch. "Captain Linda Torres, Colorado Search and Rescue. I've been flying these mountains for 20 years, and I've heard stories about you the whole time." Stories. About the ghost who appears when people need help most, then vanishes back into the wilderness. You saved my nephew's life 3 summers ago when he got lost on a fishing trip. His family never forgot that kindness. Cole was already investigating the helicopter with typical canine curiosity, seemingly unfazed by the large machine that would carry them away from the only life he'd ever known with Thatch. The dog's adaptability continued. To amaze his master, Cole seemed to understand that survival sometimes required embracing change rather than resisting it. As the search team loaded their equipment into the helicopter, Thatch stood at the edge of the clearing and looked back toward the burned ridges where his cabin had stood. The orange glow was gone now, replaced by the grey desolation of a fire's aftermath. But somehow the view no longer filled him with despair. Something important had ended in those flames, but something else had begun in the darkness of that jammed door. In Cole's desperate charge against impossible odds, in their long journey through devastation to this moment of unexpected rescue and even more unexpected opportunity, the charred walking stick lay in his hands, ruined but not forgotten. Tomorrow, if he chose to accept it, he could begin carving a new one. Not to replace what was lost, but to celebrate what had been found, the knowledge that no one is ever truly alone, that the connections we make often matter more than we realize, and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin when we thought everything had ended. Cole padded over to him, pressing against his leg in that familiar gesture of companionship and support. The dog looked up with those wise amber eyes, and in them Thatch saw reflected not the past they were leaving behind, but the future they would face together, whatever form it might take. The helicopter's rotors began spinning faster, creating a downdraft that stirred the ash around them into small whirlwinds. Thatch had never flown before. In all his years as a wilderness scout, he'd always insisted on walking into territory, believing that a man couldn't truly know land he'd only seen from the air. But now, as he helped Cole climb into the aircraft's passenger compartment, he found himself curious rather than fearful about this new experience. Cole settled onto the floor between the seats with remarkable composure, as if helicopter flights were a regular part of his routine. The dog's adaptability continued to astound Thatch. Here was a creature who had spent his entire adult life in wilderness isolation, yet he seemed to accept each new challenge with calm determination. Captain Torres handed them both headsets, showing Thatch how to adjust the microphone. "First time flying?" she asked through the intercom, and when Thatch nodded, she smiled. "Well, you're in for a treat. The view of your mountains from up here is something special." As the helicopter lifted off, Thatch felt his stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with the aircraft's motion. Through the window, he could see the full scope of the devastation for the first time. What had seemed like localized destruction from ground level revealed itself as something much more extensive, thousands of acres of blackened forest stretching across multiple ridges and valleys. His cabin valley was just a small, dark scar in a landscape that looked like it had been painted with charcoal. But as they gained altitude, other things became visible too. Patches of green where the fire had jumped over areas, leaving islands of life in the burned expanse. The silver thread of streams and rivers that had provided natural fire breaks. And everywhere, the first signs of recovery, areas where the ash was already showing hints of new growth. "It's not as bad as it looks from down there," Tom Bradley's voice crackled through the headset. He was pointing toward a valley that appeared completely destroyed from ground level, but from the air showed clear signs that the fire had burned with varying intensity. See those stands of trees that are still green? The fire went around them, not through them. And those areas that look completely black, a lot of those trees will survive. Their bark protected them. Sarah leaned forward from her seat behind them. The Forest Service has been doing recovery work in areas like this for decades. We know how to help the forest regenerate, how to replant strategically, how to manage the recovery process. But we need people who understand the subtle signs, who can read what the land is telling us about how it wants to heal. Through the aircraft's window, Thatch could see Cedar Ridge approaching in the distance, a small town nestled in a valley that had been spared by the fire's path. From the air, it looked like a tiny collection of buildings surrounded by an ocean of wilderness, a reminder of how small human settlements were in the grand scale of the mountains. Cole had positioned himself where he could look out the window, his amber eyes fixed on the landscape passing below. The dog showed no signs of airsickness or anxiety, just that same alert interest he'd always displayed when exploring new territory on foot. It occurred to Thatch that Cole might be the most adaptable creature he'd ever known, equally at home in wilderness isolation or helicopter rescue, equally comfortable with solitary survival or human company. As they descended toward the landing pad behind Cedar Ridge's small medical clinic, Thatch caught sight of something that made his heart skip. A small crowd had gathered to meet them, not just medical personnel, but townspeople, families with children, elderly folks who had probably lived in this valley for generations. Word gets around fast in small towns, Captain Torres explained, seeing his expression. When the Forest Service said they were bringing in the famous mountain hermit, people got curious. Famous. The word felt strange, applied to someone who had spent 15 years trying to remain invisible. But as the helicopter settled onto the landing pad and the rotors began to slow, Thatch could see the faces in the crowd more clearly. These weren't curiosity seekers or thrill seekers. They were people who looked genuinely concerned, genuinely glad to see that he and Cole had survived the fire. A veterinarian was waiting with a wheeled stretcher for Cole, though the dog clearly preferred to walk on his own. Dr. Martinez, no relation to the forest. Service technician was a middle-aged woman with gentle hands who immediately put both Thatch and Cole at ease. "Let's get this brave fellow checked out properly," she said, kneeling to examine Cole's injured paw right there on the landing pad. "From what I can see, someone did an excellent job with the initial treatment. This should heal up just fine with proper care." As medical personnel guided Thatch toward the clinic for his own examination, he found himself walking through a gauntlet of friendly faces and words of concern. An elderly man stepped forward from the crowd, someone Thatch recognized from his occasional supply trips to town, though they'd never spoken. "Mr. Morgan," the man said, extending a weathered hand. "Bill Patterson. I run the hardware store. Just wanted you to know. When we heard about the fire, when we heard you might be missing up there, this whole town was worried sick. You've helped a lot of folks over the years, and we don't forget kindness like that." The simple words hit Thatch with unexpected force. He'd thought of his brief encounters with lost hikers and stranded travelers as insignificant, hardly worth remembering. But clearly they had meant something to the people he'd helped, and by extension, to their families and communities. As they reached the clinic entrance, Cole turned back to look at him with those wise amber eyes, and in that look, Thatch saw something that took his breath away. It wasn't just loyalty or trust, it was pride. Cole was proud of his master, proud of the man who had helped strangers without expecting anything in return. Proud to be the companion of someone who mattered to people he'd never even met. Inside the medical clinic, Dr. Rebecca Santos examined Thatch with the thorough efficiency of someone who had treated her share of wilderness emergencies. His burns were minor, his dehydration easily corrected with IV fluids. But she was concerned about the smoke inhalation and insisted on keeping him overnight for observation. "You're in remarkably good shape for a man who's been through what you have," she said, checking his blood pressure one more time. But at your age, we don't take chances with respiratory issues. Besides, it'll give you time to think about what comes next. What came next? The question that had been haunting him since Tom Bradley first mentioned the Forest Service job offer. Through the clinic window, Thatch could see Cole in the veterinary clinic next door, surrounded by staff members who were clearly enchanted with the stoic mountain dog. Even in a medical setting, Cole was making friends, accepting attention with the same dignity he'd shown throughout their ordeal. As evening fell, Tom Bradley stopped by with a folder full of documents, job descriptions, benefit packages, maps of the proposed new ranger station location. But he also brought something else, a thick scrapbook that he set on Thatch's bedside table. "Mrs. Henderson at the post office put this together," Tom explained. "Thought you might like to see it?" The scrapbook was filled with letters, dozens of them dating back years. Letters from families thanking the mountain man who had helped their lost children. Letters from hikers who had been guided to safety by a mysterious figure who had appeared when they needed help most, then vanished before they could properly thank him. Letters from parents whose teenagers had been found by someone who had not only shown them the way home, but had taught them important lessons about wilderness survival and respect for nature. One letter, dated just 6 months ago, was from a woman named Jennifer Walsh. Her 12-year-old son had gotten separated from their hiking group during a sudden thunderstorm. A man with a black dog had found the boy, sheltered him in a natural cave, and kept him calm through the night before guiding him back to the trail where searchers eventually found them both. "He wouldn't even tell us his name," the letter read. "Just said he was glad the boy was safe and disappeared back into the forest. But my son talked about him for weeks afterward, about how the man had shown him which plants were safe to eat, how to find clean water, how to read the weather signs. He said the man treated him like he was smart and capable, not like a scared little kid. That meant the world to him." Another letter was from an elderly couple whose car had broken down on the mountain road during an unexpected snowstorm 3 winters ago. They'd been found by a man who had not only helped repair their vehicle, but had insisted they follow him to a warm shelter until the storm passed. The man had shared his food, his fire, and his knowledge of mountain weather, probably saving their lives. "We tried to pay him," the letter continued, "but he wouldn't take anything. Said helping neighbors was just what people did in the mountains. We never forgot that kindness, and we never stopped hoping we'd have a chance to return the favor someday." As Thatch read letter after letter, a pattern emerged that he'd never recognized about his own actions. To him, these had been simple encounters, opportunities to help fellow human beings who needed assistance. But to the people he'd helped, they had been life-changing moments of grace. Instances when a stranger had appeared precisely when hope was running out. Mrs. Henderson had included a note of her own in the back of the scrapbook. "Mr. Morgan, I've been copying your weather reports for 8 years because they're the most accurate observations we get from the high country. But more than that, I've been collecting these letters because I wanted you to know how many lives you've touched. You may think you've been living alone up there, but you've been part of this community all along. We just wanted to make sure you knew it." Cole appeared in the doorway, having been discharged by Dr. Martinez with a clean bill of health and a proper bandage on his paw. The dog padded over to Thatch's bed and settled on the floor beside it, positioning himself where he could keep watch over his master while maintaining a clear view of the door. Tom Bradley stood to leave, but paused at the threshold. "The job offer stands for as long as you need to consider it," he said. "But I want you to know, this isn't charity. The Forest Service has been looking for someone with your knowledge and experience for years. We need you, probably more than you need us." After Tom left, Thatch sat alone with the scrapbook, reading and rereading the letters by the soft light of the bedside lamp. Cole's steady breathing from the floor was a familiar comfort, a reminder that whatever decision he made, he wouldn't be making it alone. Outside the window, he could see the lights of Cedar Ridge twinkling in the valley, a small community of people who had somehow known him better than he'd known himself. who had valued his contributions even when he hadn't recognized their significance. The charred walking stick lay on the nightstand beside the scrapbook, a reminder of what had been lost. But the letters represented something different, what had been found, what had always been there but had remained invisible until fire and crisis had revealed the truth. For the first time since the flames had driven them from their mountain sanctuary, Thatch began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the future might hold something worth embracing. 6 months later, Thatch Morgan stood on the porch of the new ranger station, watching the morning light filter through pine trees that had somehow survived the fire. The building behind him was everything Tom Bradley had promised, a structure that blended seamlessly with its environment, built with local materials and designed to weather whatever the mountains might bring. But it was more than just a weather monitoring station. It had become what the Forest Service called a community resource center, a place where hikers could get reliable information about trail conditions, where local schools could bring students to learn about mountain ecology, where researchers could access decades of accumulated knowledge about high-altitude weather patterns. Cole lay stretched out in a patch of sunlight, his injured paw now completely healed and his black coat gleaming with health. The dog had adapted to their new life with characteristic grace, accepting the steady stream of visitors with dignified patience, while maintaining his role as Thatch's closest companion and most trusted advisor. On the desk inside, Thatch's daily weather report was ready for transmission via the satellite uplink that connected them to the National Weather Service. But these reports were different from the informal journal entries he'd once scribbled for his own reference. They were official, professional documents that would be used by meteorologists across the region to predict conditions for aviation, agriculture, and emergency response. The job had proven to be more fulfilling than he'd ever imagined. Far from the bureaucratic drudgery he'd feared, it was a perfect blend of his old skills and new challenges. He spent his mornings collecting and transmitting weather data, his afternoons leading educational programs or consulting with researchers, and his evenings working on his most ambitious project yet, a comprehensive guide to mountain survival and natural navigation that would be published by the Forest Service for use in training programs nationwide. Knock on the door interrupted his morning routine. Cole lifted his head with mild interest as Thatch opened it to find a familiar face, Jennifer Walsh, the woman who had written one of the letters in Mrs. Henderson's scrapbook. "Standing with her teenage son, Mr. Morgan?" she said a bit nervously. "I'm Jennifer Walsh. We met once, briefly when you helped my son David during that thunderstorm 3 years ago." Thatch remembered the incident clearly. Now, the scared 12-year-old who had become separated from his family during a sudden mountain storm. The boy standing beside her was taller now, more confident, but his eyes held the same intelligence that Thatch had recognized during that long night in the cave. "David's 16 now," Jennifer continued, "and he's decided he wants to study forestry in college. We were wondering if you might consider taking him on as a volunteer this summer. He's eager to learn, and frankly, you made such an impression on him that night. You're the reason he wants to work in wilderness conservation." David stepped forward with the earnest intensity that Thatch remembered. "I've been reading everything I can about forest management and climate science," the young man said. "But I want to learn from someone who really understands the land, who knows it the way you do." The request touched something deep in Thatch's heart. Here was a chance to pass on knowledge that had taken him decades to accumulate, to plant seeds that might grow into a lifetime of service to the wilderness he loved. Cole seemed to approve of the visitors, his tail thumping gently against the porch boards. "I'd be honored to have you work with us this summer," Thatch said, and the smile that spread across David's face was worth more than any government salary. As mother and son left to make arrangements for the summer program, Thatch reflected on how completely his life had changed. The solitary hermit who had once feared any contact with civilization now found himself at the center of a community that stretched far beyond the boundaries of Cedar Ridge. His daily reports were read by meteorologists in Denver and Colorado Springs. His educational programs drew visitors from across the state. His survival guide would soon be used to train Forest Service personnel nationwide. But perhaps the most profound change was in his understanding of what it meant to be connected to other people. The fire that had destroyed his cabin had revealed connections he'd never known existed, threads of influence and care that had been woven through years of small kindnesses and quiet. Service. Padded over to where Thatch stood at the porch railing, pressing his warm body against his master's leg in that familiar gesture of companionship. The dog's amber eyes were clear and content, reflecting a satisfaction that came from a life well lived and purposefully shared. "You know what the best part is, old friend?" Thatch said, scratching behind Cole's scarred ears. "We're still together, still partners in everything that matters. We've just got a bigger territory to watch over now." In the distance, he could see hikers on the trail that led up from the valley, their bright backpacks visible against the green of recovering forest. Some of them would stop at the ranger station for information or supplies. Others might get lost and need assistance. A few might even become inspired to dedicate their own lives to protecting and understanding the wilderness. Whatever challenges they brought, Thatch and Cole would be ready. They had survived fire and devastation, had walked through smoke and ash to find a new purpose on the other side. They had learned that true strength came not from isolation, but from connection. Not from independence, but from interdependence. Not from hiding from the world, but from serving it with all the wisdom and care they could muster as the morning sun climbed higher over the peaks and the first visitors of the day began making their way up the trail. Thatch Morgan smiled and went inside to begin another day of the work he'd never known he was meant to do. And Cole, faithful as ever, followed close behind, ready for whatever adventures this new chapter of their partnership might bring. In the end, they had both found their way home, not to a place, but to a purpose that was bigger than either of them alone, yet perfect for who they were together.